Hi there and welcome to this video. This is one of a few videos on my learning curve with the Atomos Ninja V plus my Nikon ZX mirrorless camera. Now I know while many of you don't have a Ninja V, I have received quite a few comments expressing quite a bit of interest in what it can do and how you go about using it. So this is one in a short series of videos about my experiences with the Atomos Ninja V. So in this video I'm going to look at the Nlog profile. Again, it's an area where there is some info out there, both from Nikon and from Atomos. However, to get the most from it, you really need to develop your skills because there is a real art to it, and that requires a bit of technical reading and a little bit of practice. I've tried to use it on a number of occasions and found that actually the effort involved has outweighed the benefits I get from it, and that's probably because I'm not, or I haven't been in the past, getting quite the right settings to record on, and then that making it easier to do the post-processing. So I'll try and cover all of that in this video. So let's start by looking at what is a log profile. So if we think about how videos are recorded, then obviously the lens is focusing the light onto the sensor of the camera, and each pixel is translating the amount of light that is hitting it to an electronic voltage, and more light equals a higher voltage. You then have the camera's analog to digital converter, which converts the voltage into a digital exposure level. That's then encoded, compressed and stored, and that's where the codecs come in, and I'll put a link above to my video on some real-world usage of the different codecs and the outputs you get from them with the Ninja V, and I'll put that link above. So if we start simple and we consider 8-bit recording, and that obviously has 256 different exposure levels. With normal profiles, each of the 256 levels are linearly mapped to 0, which is black, through to pure white, which is 255, and this gives us footage which looks really good out of the camera. It has some good skin tones. However, in certain more challenging circumstances, this isn't the best way because, as we know, light isn't linear. All of you will know that a one-stop change in exposure either doubles or halves the light level. And therefore that means that the highlights or brighter colours get a greater number of the 256 exposure levels, and the shadows and blacks get a lower number, and therefore that can give us some challenges in video editing in pulling out any details from the shadows. Those of you who take still images will know that's one of the benefits of RAW and how good the dynamic range is on modern Nikon cameras. And therefore by just using a linear profile, we're perhaps missing out on opportunities in those more challenging situations. So what's the solution? Well, it's a log profile. And what this does is it more accurately maps the light to the exposure values and therefore evens out, giving a greater number of exposure values to record the shadows and the darker colours, which therefore gives more detail and more ability to pull out details from those shadows. Therefore it's really useful, I said, in some more challenging situations, and what I'm thinking of there are, perhaps where you're recording in a high contrast environment where you've got some very high bright highlights and you've got some shadows, and therefore you need to pull some detail out of the shadows to enhance that dynamic range. So that's a very quick canter through what is a log profile. So what is Nlog specifically? Well, Nlog is a unique log profile that's been developed by Nikon to get full advantage out of the sensors and the dynamic range of their sensors in Nikon cameras. And they say that it can get up to 12 stops of dynamic range from the Nlog with their sensors. It's optimized for 10-bit recording, so whereas with 8-bit you had 256 exposure levels, with 10-bit you've got 1024. And what that means is, whereas with an 8-bit recording with 256 exposure levels, you can record 16.7 million colours. With 10-bit and its 1024 exposure levels, you can record up to 1.07 billion colours. So as these three example images from Nikon show, what you get out of the camera is quite a washed out, flat footage. That enables you to then pull out details from the shadows, and then you can colour grade it to add colours back in post-processing. So more steps in the process, but in certain circumstances you can get a much better outcome from those challenging circumstances. So what kit setup do you need to be able to record Nlog? Well, because it's Nlog and it's customized to the Nikon range of cameras, you will obviously need a Nikon camera, and as of today the cameras that are capable of Nlog recording are the Z6 and Z7 and the D780. Because it's 10-bit, you will need an external recorder to connect via HDMI to your camera, and obviously the Atomos Ninja V is the one I'm using. And then you will need to post-process the footage to colour grade it, and therefore you'll need something like Final Cut Pro, Adobe Premiere Pro or DaVinci Resolve. And Nikon has produced a lookup table, a LUT, which allows you to very quickly adjust the footage in post-production back to what they expect you can get from the Nlog profile. So it does require you to think about both the capture and the post-processing as an end-to-end workflow. So how do we go about setting up to capture Nlog? Well, as I said, getting the optimal out of Nlog does require more effort, both in recording and post-production. So in this, I'm going to assume that the camera is connected to the external recorder via the HDMI. And to set up Nlog, you go to the Setup menu, you scroll either up or down to the HDMI option, and you go into there, and there you can obviously choose your output resolution. I tend to record at 4K, 24 frames per second. You then scroll down and you have to choose the output data depth and select that to 10-bit, and then go down one more option to Nlog and select that to on. Now there is an ISO related limit that recording in Nlog imposes, and that is that the minimum ISO that Nlog will record is ISO 800, and therefore obviously the maximum ISO has to be 1600 or above. And this will matter when you're thinking about the settings you're going to use. So for these studio setups, I tend to use as I say, I record 4K at 24 frames per second, so multiplying the frames per second by 2 to get my shutter speed is 1/50th of a second, and that's fixed. I look to try and blur out the background without making the depth of field too shallow, so I tend to shoot at f3.2. And therefore what that normally means for an 8-bit recording is that my ISO is about ISO 320. Obviously, if the minimum ISO for Nlog is ISO 800, you have to play around with your settings to get that right. As I said, the footage is recorded on the SSD in the Ninja V. So again, check out the codec video to understand how you set up, which codec to choose and how you set that up. And what is really important for Nlog and being able to post-process Nlog well and successfully is that you need to nail the exposure. And this is where the Ninja V or some of the Ninja V functionality becomes really important. So there's a couple of ways of nailing the exposure, and the first one is using the Luma waveform in the Ninja V. And I'll put up some pictures because recording video on the Ninja while I'm recording this is a bit of a challenge, so I'll capture some photos and we can look at those. But what you do is use the Luma waveform and a grey card. I've got a really simple set here of grey, white and black, but you'll need one of those because what you've got to try and do is set the Luma waveform for mid-grey to about 35% on the value up the side to make sure that actually you're recording more at the shadows end than the highlights, and therefore if it was a normal histogram it'd be very much skewed over to the left of the histogram. The second way of going about it is probably the easier way, and that's using the Ninja V false colour scope. And what this does is it assigns different colours to different areas of exposure. As you can see, this is the set of colours that the Ninja V will assign to different exposure levels, and you'll see that the highlights tend to be red and the shadows tend to be blues and blacks. And whereas zebras just show you where you're overexposed, actually the false colour scope shows you all of the different exposures in the image, which can be really useful. And when you're setting up to record Nlog, what you need to try and do and try and achieve is to get your skin tones to sit somewhere between the 60 and 80% on the scale, so showing grey and capping out at yellow. What you also have to do is remember that when you're exposing and looking at the false colour scope, you need to be exposing for post-LUT in processing. So in the Ninja V, you can set up for the monitor to show what it's recording in either native or in the Z6, Nikon Z6 LUT. So you need to go into the monitor and choose the Z6 LUT, which will show you the footage as if the Z6 LUT had been overlaid on it. If you haven't uploaded the Z6 LUT and installed it on your Ninja V, it's fairly simple. Check it out in the manual. It's just a case of downloading the LUT, putting it on your SSD and then importing it in. But it is really important to set that up so that your monitor is showing post-LUT rather than the native input flat profiled image. So apologies about the slight lighting changes during the filming of this, but as I've been filming, a thunderstorm has gone through and it's changed all the lighting in the studio. I don't have the luxury of having a completely blacked out studio, and therefore the lighting does vary depending on how much sun there is. Normally I can record the videos quicker than the sun changes. However, I wasn't predicting a thunderstorm going through, so apologies if the lighting does vary throughout the video. A bit embarrassing when I'm doing a video about Nlog, so it'll be interesting to see how it copes with that, because I am recording this whole video in Nlog just to see how much easier or more difficult it is for a video like this. So to help with that, let's take a look at some quick comparisons between the 10-bit Nlog footage, both ungraded and graded with a Nikon LUT and a custom LUT, and some 8-bit footage with various profiles. So this is as like for like as I can get. I've got my Z6 with the 24-70 f2.8 lens fitted to it, and it's recording Nlog in 10-bit, and it's doing that at 1/50th of a second, ISO 800 and f4. I've then got my Z7 with the 24-70 f4 lens on it, and again that is recording at 1/50th of a second at f4 and ISO 800, but it's recording 8-bit and a flat profile. So it'll be interesting to see how the two compare. So in these kind of videos, getting the skin tones right is really important, and that's why I tend to use the 8-bit flat profile for this. As you can see, it gets it reasonably close with regards to the skin tones. They're very slightly too pink for me, but with a little bit of secondary colour grading we can correct that quite easily. You can see from the 10-bit Nlog ungraded there's quite a difference between the flat profile and the ungraded. And then on the right hand side, if we overlay the Nikon LUT onto it, it brings the skin tones up to much closer to where the flat profile is, so very easily correctable. So with regards to skin tones, I think the 10-bit Nlog with the Nikon LUT works quite well. However, when we look at the whole image, what we can see is actually in the background underneath the underground sign that the shadows have been really compressed by the LUT, making the blacks really black, and you lose a lot of detail in it. Especially when we jump back to the 8-bit and compare that, you can see a lot more detail in the shadows in that same area. Now, if I'm honest, this could be because of my slightly imprecise one light setup here, because when you look back at the ungraded Nlog footage, you can clearly see the detail is there in the shadows. So what I've done for the whole of this video, because it's all been shot in 10-bit Nlog, is I've done my own colour grading, which I think brings it back to a far more natural, far more realistic colour grade compared to the Nikon LUT. Now, as I say, this could be, the difference between two could be because of the lighting setup I have. I'm very constrained in my studio and what I can achieve here. I've got a one light setup today, and it's quite heavily backlit, and as I say, the lighting has been changing because of a thunderstorm going through, and the white balance has perhaps been slightly out of kilter. We've got mixed lighting sources, and therefore actually what I've managed to achieve with a very simple colour grade, and the secondary colour grade took me probably less than a minute to achieve, is a far more natural look which keeps the shadows and the totality and the benefits of that 10-bit Nlog image. So again, we've got the Z6 shooting Nlog in 10-bit. We've got the Z7 this time shooting in auto profile 8-bit. Obviously, picked quite a saturated profile this time with regards to the skin tones, and then comparing it with the Nikon LUT color graded 10-bit Nlog. And then finally, we've got my own colour grading, which I think is the most accurate out of the various colour gradings. So as you can see, the auto setting in 8-bit creates a very saturated set of skin tones, and probably not the best starting point for this kind of video. So again, we've got the Z6 shooting Nlog 10-bit, and this time we've got the Z7 shooting 8-bit with neutral profile. And what we can see is from that you get a slightly more saturated skin tones from the neutral profile than the colour graded Nlog. If we look at the overall image, the colours aren't too bad in this. With a little bit of colour grading, we could get this back to an acceptable position. So neutral isn't that bad. It's quite a balanced approach. Again, comparing it to the custom graded Nlog, it gives you an impression of how we might be able to get that 8-bit back quite simply. So because the Nikon LUT had underwowed me with its compressing of the shadows, I thought I wanted to do a bit of another trial with perhaps a single lighting source, so lighting wouldn't be the issue, with everything else the same. So our veg box had just arrived, and it's got some beautifully bright coloured carrots, spring greens and Romano peppers in it. So again, I've set up the Z6 to film Nlog 10-bit into the Ninja V, and the Z7 to record 8-bit in flat profile. So this is the veg box with a single source of natural window light coming from behind. I set the exposure on the Nlog to be in the sort of greys to yellow zone on the false colour scope, and that came out with an ISO of 8000. And then I set the Z7 to be broadly similar, using the, or to be the same actually, using the histogram on the back screen. So this is the 10-bit Nlog, and as we would expect, the colours are desaturated slightly, but you can still see the turnip in the shadows in the top left-hand corner. So quite a good dynamic range. So this is the 8-bit flat profile from the Z7. Again, quite good rendition, quite a good starting point for a bit of tweaking in colour grading. And then back to the Nlog 10-bit, and this time with the Nikon LUT applied. And as you can see, the colours have become very saturated. The turnip has almost disappeared in the shadows at the top left. So clearly I'm doing something wrong somewhere. And if any of you have got any ideas, drop them in the comments below. It'd be great to find out and understand it a bit more, because then we come on to my own custom graded version of the image, and you can see the turnip is quite clearly there in the shadows in the top left. The colours are really nice and vibrant, and the exposure is really good. So there is clearly something going slightly awry in the way I'm using the LUT, and it'd be great to find out. So I hope this video has given you some insight as to how to approach Nlog if you want to, the benefits you can get from it, and also some of the challenges. In particular, the Nikon LUT that I've been struggling with. Now, I've also, since filming the footage, I've tried various footage with various codecs, and there was no difference. I've tried using Premiere Pro on a Mac and also my PC, so it's not the monitor. I've also tried it with DaVinci Resolve, and that I get the same output. So it's probably in the settings somewhere. I'm doing something a bit silly, or there's a problem with the LUT. I don't know. Any ideas? Put them in the comments below. It'd be great to get some advice from you guys where you're ahead of me. So as I've said, I'm not an expert in this area. This is pushing the boundaries of my skill set, and that's why I'm doing it in part, and therefore these videos are about you learning at the same time as I learn. So any advice you've got, gratefully appreciated. Will I use 10-bit Nlog? Well, probably, because I think it's pushing the boundaries on a couple of different dimensions for me. One, about challenging me to think about how I expose, and having to expose in a particular way for the to get the best out of the 10-bit Nlog footage. Also, it's going to challenge me to think about my lighting setup. Can I take that to the next notch up? I'll probably be mixing using 10-bit Nlog with 8-bit flat profile, particularly when I'm out and I don't want to have to carry the Ninja V with me necessarily. I want a lightweight setup. So I hope you found this video useful. As always, if you did, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell below, and you'll be notified of future videos. And I look forward to seeing you on a future video.